Is it better to kill a man or break him? It's a question many people have asked over the years, but for the scientists at America's Edgewood Arsenal, the answer was an easy one. Better to end a man's sanity than to end his life. At the height of the Cold War, the United States put that to the test on its own people. For decades, thousands of unknowing victims were subject to mind-altering experiments at Edgewood Arsenal. Lured in by lies and false promises, civilians and soldiers alike became guinea pigs for dangerous new drugs that could turn even the most capable soldier into a delusional wreck. And there was no guarantee that the effects would end when the test was over. This is the shocking truth of the secret experiments at Edgewood Arsenal. The German introduction of gas attacks in the First World War opened a new dimension of warfare. The US established its Chemical Warfare Service in 1918 to explore ways to use or defend against different types of chemical weapons. Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland was one of several facilities attached to this chemical research. Its early focus was on chemical gas. Much of the US's weaponized gas stockpile was produced there and stored there after the end of the war. For the next 20 years, Edgewood's main chemical work was on refining the use of this gas. By the 1940s, the facility had constructed experimental gas chambers where they ran tests on so-called volunteers. Most volunteers were soldiers who were told they were partaking in harmless tests. For example, some were told they would be testing the Army's new summer uniforms. Instead, they found themselves shoved into gas chambers to be used as human guinea pigs, and were threatened with court-martial if they tried to leave. The tests measured a variety of things. For example, they determined the exact ratio of human to gas chamber needed to maximize the effectiveness of a gas, 5%. They also had soldiers wear contaminated clothes for hours on end to measure long-term effects, which usually meant chemical burns. Records on the tests are minimal, and it is unknown if anyone died. We do know that the Chemical Causes Medical Division sent out over 1,000 letters to soldiers after the Second World War, thanking them for their role in Edgewood chemical experiments. But survivors reported that they weren't told the truth. Edgewood lied about what was actually being tested and intentionally misled people about the effects. For example, soldiers were told they were testing a benign gas that might produce a runny nose or a tight chest, when in fact, they were being given small doses of sarin gas. Acquiring test subjects was easy. Edgewood was advertised as an easy volunteer assignment for soldiers. 4-day work weeks, great facilities, and by the late 1960s, it had become an easy escape from deployment to Vietnam. Robert Kraft was 20 years old when he was offered to go to Edgewood. The deal was too good to pass up. Kraft soon found himself confined to a padded cell for 3 days straight. He and his fellow subjects were administered an aerosol pesticide through a breathing mask, which left him weak and dizzy. The scientists would conduct regular tests, taking blood pressure reading, pulse, and other indicators to measure the effects. He never knew that was what he signed up for. After the war, Edgewood scientists started delving into more unorthodox sorts of chemical weapons. The Cold War required entirely new angles of chemical weapon research. Edgewood's technical director, Dr. L. Wilson Green, published a paper in 1949 entitled Psychochemical Warfare, a New Concept of War, where he argued for the use of mind-altering chemical weapons to disable enemy soldiers. I am convinced that it is possible, by means of the techniques of psychochemical warfare, to conquer an enemy without the wholesale killing of his people or the mass destruction of his property. CIA Director Allen Dulles took notice and soon approved funding for the weaponization of mind-altering drugs. This research had 3 goals. First, to weaponize mind-altering drugs for military use. Second, to weaponize mind-altering drugs for intelligence or espionage work. Third, to develop defenses against such weapons. Edgewood partnered with civilian hospitals to acquire test subjects for their early experiments. Edgewood always claimed these tests were consensual, but survivors claimed they weren't fully informed about the drugs or their consequences. It didn't take long for these experiments to go wrong. 42-year-old New York psychiatric patient Harold Blauer was one of the test subjects who initially agreed to participate in drug tests while under the care of the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Blauer participated in several tests, but asked to withdraw when he began experiencing hallucinations. He was unaware that this was the entire point of the tests. Despite withdrawing his consent, he was injected again on December 30th, 1952 with 450 milligrams of MDA. Within a few hours, he was dead, leaving behind a wife and 2 children. A variety of substances were tested. PCP was tested multiple times, but the results were seen as too dangerous and unpredictable. At least one test subject had a psychotic break and had to be hospitalized for 6 weeks. Other subjects reported traumatizing visions, including being attacked by horrible green-eyed monsters and feeling like they were suffering full-body electric shocks. It is believed that many of these early experiments led to the CIA's MK-Ultra experiments into brainwashing. The big breakthrough at Edgewood came with LSD. With its powerful psychological effects, it soon became the favorite of Edgewood scientists. The driving force behind much of this was Dr. Murray Van Sim. An eccentric and imposing man known for testing his drugs on himself, Van Sim was an enthusiastic supporter of Edgewood's mind-altering drug experiments on soldiers and civilians. Surviving records indicate at least 600 people were tested with LSD at Edgewood, but the Army acknowledges that these records were probably incomplete. The tests saw a range of scenarios. LSD might be given in a fairly conventional clinical setting, while other times, subjects were kept in solitary confinement for hours leading up to the test to see if it had any effect. Subjects would then be tested on a variety of tasks, ranging from mental tests to rifle disassembly and even volleyball performance. They wanted to know every possible effect and application. Subjects often didn't know what they were signing up for. Tony Mannheim was a clerk at an intelligence center in Maryland when he was offered the chance to join a 3-day drug trial in Edgewood. Mannheim signed up and joined fellow subjects at a cocktail party shortly after arriving. As the subjects drank and talked about what might happen when the tests began the next day, one of the men suddenly began to scream. The man yelled and shouted uncontrollably, but the Edgewood staff did nothing. Mannheim soon realized that he felt strange as well. Looking down at the cocktail glass in his hands, he realized they'd all been secretly drugged. The party was an experiment. Mannheim later learned that they'd slipped LSD into their cocktails to test if it might work for spies working in a real party. By 1958, the LSD tests moved out of the lab. Field tests at Fort Bragg in North Carolina measured the effectiveness of entire units when subjected to LSD. In September of that year, 59 men of the 18th Airborne Corps Field Artillery were given LSD and sent out on drill and survey exercises. LSD caused a massive reduction in the unit's effectiveness in basic tasks, as expected, but the tests struggled to find a practical way to apply the drug to an enemy unit. Field tests for intelligence work were more successful and more frightening. In 1960, Edgewood sent its own Major Ernest Robert Clovis to join an Army intelligence Black Ops team to conduct LSD experiments in real intelligence situations. Their initial experiments were in Europe, where around a dozen targets were kidnapped and drugged to see if it made it easier to extract information. One such target was Private James Thornwell. An American soldier stationed in France, He was suspected of stealing classified documents, but the army couldn't find hard evidence. One day, he was approached by an agent of Clovis's team. He told Thornwell that assassins were coming for him and he needed to be taken to a safe location. They proceeded to drive him out to a small house in the countryside. Thornwell did not know exactly when it happened, but by the time he arrived, he was feeling paranoid and was starting to see things. He did not know at the time that he'd been drugged with LSD. As the hallucinations took hold, Thornwell was dragged into the house and interrogated. As the agent demanded to know about the documents, Thornwell began to see himself being thrown around the room or fusing into his chair as the agent morphed into a frightening creature before his eyes. Thornwell was eventually released, but he never recovered from the experience. After returning to the States, he became a paranoid depressive recluse, talking only to his doctors for months on end before being found dead in his pool. The experiments were deemed a success, and Clovis took them to East Asia in 1962. Records are vague, but seem to indicate a similar pattern of abduction and drugging. In one particularly brutal case, the target fell into a virtual coma, and when he recovered, he was in so much pain that he begged Clovis's team to kill him. We also know that Clovis's team was personally ordered to Vietnam by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in 1963 to experiment on Viet Cong prisoners. Records show the team went there, but no records of any tests survive. By the 1960s, however, Edgewood Arsenal's attention had shifted away from LSD and towards a new drug nicknamed BZ. BZ, or 3-quinculidinyl benzylate, and designated at Edgewood as EA2277, was an anticholinergic drug that interfered with the brain's ability to control motion and coordination. In low doses, it could leave someone unable to carry out basic tasks. At higher doses, it produced delirium, triggering hallucinations and bizarre behavior. However, it was not considered to be fatal. Dr. Van Sim was immediately fascinated by it and even tested it on himself. "I kept falling down. The people at the lab assigned someone to follow me around with a mattress," he said. But the driving force behind BZ experiments was Dr. James Ketchum. Ketchum was convinced that BZ could transform warfare entirely, and he'd do anything to prove it. Hundreds of alleged volunteers were drugged with BZ over several years. Ketchum kept meticulous records of his work and proudly recounted it in great detail in his memoirs, allowing us a vivid insight into what happened. BZ's ability to produce hallucinations and delirium was undeniable. One subject reportedly saw snakes, rats, and a monkey running around the test chamber and became convinced he was covered in blood. Before long, he fell into a raging panic. Subject broke a wooden chair and smashed a hole in the wall after cutting down a 4x7 fit panel of padding. It took 3 men to restrain him. He was clearly terrified and convinced we were intending to kill him, Ketchum wrote. This delirium could come and go in moments. One moment, you could ask a subject who wrote Hamlet and they'd easily answer Shakespeare. The next, they'd respond by crouching down and trying to pull an imaginary drain cover out of the floor. In February 1963, one subject, who Ketchum gave the false name John Blake, was subjected to a 7-day BZ trial. Ketchum's team observed him constantly, recording the drug's progress. Within 2 hours, he needed help to walk. Within 5, he was experiencing wild mood swings, saying he'd die if he wasn't let outside 1 minute, and then lying down for a nap the next. By hour 6, he was swatting imaginary bugs off the wall and was utterly convinced that Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was in the cell with him. As the days went by, Blake's delirium lurched between darkly comical and almost deadly. At one point, Blake began climbing the walls and trying to speak to Jesus. At another time, when a nurse went to take medical readings, he suddenly grabbed her by the throat and began to choke her, only to let her go, sit on the edge of the bed, and laugh. Blake's case is one of the best recorded, and Ketchum considered it an amazing success. It was proof that a healthy man could be neutralized by exposure to the drug. But these results needed to be reproduced in the field to really matter. In May 1962, Ketchum took BZ out into the field for a combat test. 4 soldiers were set up in a fake outpost for 3 days to measure unit effectiveness under the influence of BZ. Of the soldiers, 1 was given a placebo, 2 were given normal doses, while the 4th, named Ronald Zadrozny, was given a higher dose. Zadrozny was the smallest and weakest of the men, and Ketchum chose him for the higher dose because, quote, if he panicked at some point, the others could no doubt subdue him. Within hours, it was obvious that Zadrozny couldn't function. The 2 normal dose soldiers were capable of completing some basic tasks, like putting on their gas masks, but Zadrozny was totally incapable. Ketchum's team fed them false scenarios of enemy movements that the soldiers struggled to respond to. Zadrozny was totally delirious, pacing around the outpost, muttering to himself and experiencing fits of paranoia and depression for 36 unbroken hours. Ketchum ruled that a 4-man unit could be totally disabled if just one of them was rendered as useless as Zadrozny. All of the soldiers agreed that they wouldn't have been able to survive a combat scenario with him in that state. Ketchum always insisted that no one ever died in his tests, but they certainly came close. In 1962, wind tunnel tests for cloud dispersal of BZ went badly wrong, when the test subject, an Army reservist called Walter Payne, was virtually paralyzed for hours, save for uncontrollable twitching. He was rushed to hospital and ultimately survived, but Ketchum's team never followed up to measure the long-term effects. In 1963, a similarly intense reaction to a wind tunnel test left Jason Butler Jr. on the brink of death for a week, with a fever of 103 degrees and violent spasms. He too survived, but received no follow-up from Ketchum. Then there were the deaths that came after the tests. Many subjects experienced sudden, inexplicable ends shortly after leaving Edgewood. For example, one soldier emerged from a BZ test seemingly fine, but within 48 hours, he intentionally crashed his car into the back of a truck. The sudden fatal action was completely unexpected and could only have been intentional. In 1964, Army intelligence approached Ketchum and the Edgewood team about possibly gassing a Soviet ship near Alaska. Before launching the operation, however, they needed one final test. Project Dork was an elaborate test held in Utah in November 1964, where a small squad of soldiers were gassed with BZ and set various tasks like running an outpost. The gas produced the desired effects. Regular cognitive tests showed a massive decline in mental functioning as the test went on, and the squad was unable to answer basic math questions, let alone run a checkpoint. Ketchum was so impressed by the test that he had the footage compiled into a bizarre propaganda film named Cloud of Confusion. Ketchum was happy, but the army was not. The gas needed to be applied under controlled circumstances to be effective, and Ketchum's tests failed to convince them that it could be practical in a real scenario. The Soviet ship plan was scrapped, and interest in BZ soon ebbed away. American intervention in Vietnam after 1965 shifted attention to other forms of chemical weapons, like napalm and Agent Orange. While Ketchum and his Edgewood team remained convinced that BZ was a more humane alternative, they could not persuade Army leadership. A demoralized Ketchum left Edgewood for several years, and by the time he returned in 1968, things had changed. Anti-war feeling and criticism of US chemical weapon usage brought new scrutiny to Edgewood. Ketchum tried resuming experiments, but now found that his new medical staff opposed him. They questioned the ethics of human testing and criticized his use of drugs whose long-term consequences were unknown. Several leaked information to the press. By November 1969, public pressure mounted, and the Nixon administration swore never to use BZ in combat. Ketchum departed Edgewood for good shortly after. In 1975, Congress opened an investigation into unethical practices in the government's chemical weapons program. Dr. Van Sim was called to testify, where he admitted to the experiments, but defended his work as necessary and ethical. The Army did later admit that, quote, "Some of the techniques then employed now appear less than perfect," and acknowledged that many subjects were not fully informed of the effects or intent of those experiments. Edgewood's chemical experiments were eventually closed, and the documents seized. The site has since been renamed and is now part of the Aberdeen Proving Ground, which is still in use by the military. The truth of what happened there has been slow to escape. Subjects were sworn to secrecy for at least 50 years, under threat of imprisonment. Only in the 2000s did survivors begin to come forward in large numbers. Numerous soldiers reported serious long-term health effects, including cancer, paranoia, depression, blindness, Parkinson's disease, and other life-altering or life-ending complications. In 2009, Vietnam Veterans of America filed a lawsuit against the government to declassify and compensate the victims of the Edgewood experiments. The courts eventually ruled that affected survivors were entitled to have their medical costs paid by the Army, but it was too late for many. Most subjects were already dead. In 2013, the Army was ordered to notify survivors of the decision and offer them medical coverage. 1,000 letters were sent out, but by 2018, just 64 people were receiving payouts. James Ketchum was proud of his work until his death in 2019. In 2006, he published his memoir, where he detailed the experiments and defended them as necessary and moral. He believed that his work would be a less lethal alternative to nuclear weapons or napalm, and that the issues of consent or undisclosed health effects were a small price to pay to develop weapons that he hoped would avoid mass killing. Statistically, he said, with all the medical monitoring his team did, his test subjects were safer at Edgewood than they were on any other military assignment. It is true that there were no reported deaths from experiments at Edgewood itself, or in any associated experiments aside from Harold Blauer's death in 1952. However, a disturbing list of psychotic breaks, self-inflicted deaths, and unexplained health conditions haunt Edgewood's legacy, like Ronald Zadrochny, who'd received the highest dose of BZ during the 1962 experiment, suffered a sudden psychotic break, which led to him shooting his wife and then himself. Robert Kraft developed uncontrollable tremors in his hands that left him unable to work, then prostate cancer. Hundreds of other veterans experienced similarly life-changing side effects. No one knows how much Edgewood was responsible for these later problems, but most died without the government even admitting it happened, let alone investigating it. I was naive. I was patriotic. My government would never hurt me, Robert Kraft later said. At Edgewood, thousands of innocent people learned just how incorrect that belief was.